In this presentation for Module 3, I'm going to discuss different themes and trends related to both system as well as institution level governance in higher education from a comparative perspective, using some additional examples to those discussed in your readings. Governance basically means who makes decisions and how. So in the medieval times, when higher education was emerging, governance models were based on higher education and universities' relationship to the national government. So universities on the European continent had a very strong and close relationship with their national governments. For example, in France, dating back to the Napoleonic times, their university presidents had very minimal power and authority. Faculty had a lot of influence compared to the president as a collective, and most of decisions of consequence were made by the state. So, for example, the president was elected by several faculty and sort of national committees, and while faculty primarily made academic decisions, most choices around hiring and budgets were made by the National Ministry of Higher Education and Research, as well as strategy decisions. That was the French model actually until 2007, when a law was passed to give institutions more autonomy and presidents much more power, especially compared to faculty. In contrast to the European continent, the Anglo-Saxon model historically was what we saw in the US and in the UK, assumed that the national government was too political and that higher education should mostly be separated from its direct control. So those systems historically gave more power and autonomy to boards of trustees, presidents, and faculty compared to the continental model. But then today, there's kind of a convergence. So as I said, using France as an example, the continental model of strong national role has moved more towards presidential and board authority with some role for the state and limited faculty involvement. So there's a bit of convergence now, and we'll get into those details in a second. I'm going to illustrate how many of the concepts related to system and institution level governance today look like in reality using Ethiopia as a case. I've selected Ethiopia because most of the readings, first of all, don't really reference global south contexts. And then also, as you know, I'm very familiar with this system, so I can give you a lot of personal insight. In addition, though, you might be surprised to know that Ethiopia's total population is only 130 million compared to our US population of 340 million total. So 130 compared to 340, but 60% of Ethiopians are under the age of 25. It's the second youngest country in Africa. And the US population under age 25 is only about 75 million. So actually, Ethiopians right now, going forward right now and into the future, will have a larger college-going population by number than the United States. And if you look at global demographics, the number of youth in Africa is a pattern we see across the continent in contrast to Europe, North America, and China. So if we're thinking about the future of tertiary education, African countries and Ethiopia in particular is where students are going to be coming from in the future. So this slide, I know it's really tiny and difficult to see, but just to give you a quick snapshot of the country and its higher education system, Ethiopia is split up into several regions. The number changes a lot, to be honest. Since I've started working there, they've split the boundaries up differently, but this is a general picture from a few years ago. And as you can see, the little red schoolhouses here are the public universities in the country. Right now there are about 50 and then just over 300 total tertiary institutions in the country. And the university I work in primarily is up here, Wallo University, and then Addis Ababa is down here, the capital city. But this is Wallo up here. Anyways, in terms of access, one other thing I want to point out, you might remember in your readings this in Module 3, mention of Martin Tro's model of elite versus mass versus universal systems. So to contextualize Ethiopia, approximately 13% of males and 8% of females under the age of 25 are enrolled in tertiary education. So you'll recall that TRO defined an elite system as less than 15% of the eligible population being enrolled. At this point, therefore, Ethiopia would certainly be considered still an elite system of higher education, in contrast to the US, where we're, according to TRO's definition of 40% at least, are approaching or at universal level of access. Ethiopia, though, in contrast, would be considered more of an elite system right now. Okay, so applying some of the ideas from your readings. First of all, technically, Ethiopia's government is a federal system, which you read about, the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia since 1992. Before that, Ethiopia was governed by a pretty terrible communist regime called the Derg. And then before that, there was a series of emperors, including Haile Selassie, who I'm going to mention in a second again, because he had a huge role in advancing higher education, actually establishing higher education in the country. But anyways, so in practice, again, it's a federal system. And these regions I mentioned here, they all have regional administrations, but in practice, those governments have limited influence over their universities compared to the Federal Ministry of Education. Okay, so applying some of the ideas from the Godajabur chapter, Ethiopia would be considered kind of a combination of dual or binary systems. So they have a TVET sector as well as a university sector, and that's the idea of binary, right? And then I'm going to get into this idea of stratification in a second because it's a very recent development that only was launched maybe 2022. But as you read, most of the binary systems came out of the 1950s and 60s, and Ethiopia is one of them. So the Ministry of Education, or MOE, which everybody calls it, is the agency responsible for governing all of the country's private as well as public universities and colleges. Higher education is a relatively new sector in Ethiopia. The first university was established by Emperor Haile Selassie, who I mentioned, in 1950. So Addis Ababa University was their first university in 1950. I shared some pictures of the Kennedy Library last module, but the campus is actually of Addis Ababa University is Haile Selassie's family land, and his palace is in the middle of campus, right near the library. And it's a really amazing museum and occasional event space. So if you ever make it to Addis Ababa, the city, definitely visit the university campus and check out his palace. It's amazing. So when I first started working in Ethiopia, higher education was governed under a separate ministry called Moshi, which everybody called it Moshi, that was established in 2018. But then 4 years later, it was absorbed back into the Ministry of Education. A very short-lived experiment, and this is something, at least in Ethiopia, that I have witnessed in my time working there. There are a lot of proclamations that are issued by the government to try to optimize the quality and efficiency of the system, but they don't give their reforms a lot of time to test out. And if they don't think it's working, they change it up real quick. So now the current model is that the state minister for higher education reports directly to the Minister of Education. So there is not a separate Ministry for Higher Education in Ethiopia. And then, as I mentioned, as of late, starting in approximately 2022, and you can actually check out the document, it's in the supplemental section of our Canvas site, but the Ministry of Education has recognized that they would like to differentiate their university system more. So it previously has just been, here are the 50 some universities, public universities, but the Ministry of Education is moving more towards a classification system, somewhat like the Carnegie system. So that's something that I'm actually working very closely with several Ethiopian leaders on what that will look like in terms of implementing at the individual campus level. But it's a really cool case in sort of system-wide governance and differentiation. It's happening now. But then, as I said, it's a binary system right now. And the other system is the TVET system, the technical college system. And that's governed by a totally separate ministry, the Ministry of Labor and Skills, or MOLS, which is what the Ethiopians call it for short. And they oversee the TVETs, as well as a lot of connections between industry and the government. And so their priority is really about very applied practical skills and making sure that the TVETs are preparing students for jobs. And in fact, if you look at employment data, TVET graduates are more likely to get a job immediately after graduation compared to the new university graduates. So the technical college sector, the vocational sector in Ethiopia, which is governed by MOLS, is, in terms of at least sort of immediate employment, doing better right now than the university sector. But this is what this idea of a binary system looks like in practice. So one ministry totally separate for the universities, and then a separate ministry or sort of oversight body for the technical or vocational aspect of the tertiary system. And while they meet occasionally or whatever, these are very separate agencies. So when I was doing my project, my USAID-sponsored project in Ethiopia, I had to meet separately. Here I am at the Ministry of Education. I had to meet separately with the guy from MOLS, who is my counterpart. The Ministry of Education and the MOLS guy were separate relationships and separate sort of agencies that we had to navigate when we were implementing our project, because we were working in both sectors, but the institutions were governed by completely different agencies. Okay, so I want to give you a little bit more insight into how the Ministry of Education steers higher education in Ethiopia. Here's a picture of the current Minister of Education, Birhanu Nega, and actually I've included his biography, actually not his biography, an interesting story about his background in the supplemental materials on Canvas. He was formerly a professor of economics at Bucknell University in the U.S., and then he was leading a rebel army in Eritrea after he decided to return to Africa. He's a very, very interesting man with an interesting history. But anyways, that's not what we're talking about here. So in terms of the Ethiopian Ministry of Education, as you might recall in his chapter about private universities, Levy differentiates governance models into laissez-faire, pluralistic market, state control, and state steering. So the U.S. is more of a pluralistic market model, while Ethiopia is definitely an example of the last, a state steering model. So the minister oversees the system. So they, it, he, them decide strategies and what the system's major activities are. So certainly while industry, as well as especially multilateral NGOs like the World Bank, the MasterCard Foundation, formerly USAID, GIZ, etc., have some influence, it's really the government who makes the final decisions about everything. That's this idea of steering, right? And MOLS, the Ministry of Labor and Skills, makes those decisions about the TVET sector. So the Ministry of Education is the university sector. So what are some of the specific decisions that the Ministry of Education oversees in Ethiopia? So first of all, personnel decisions. The ministry is very involved or has authority over who is on each university's board of trustees, and typically they're pretty commonly external stakeholders who have a lot of political influence. For example, every board of public universities has a chair that is a minister from another state agency. So the university where I'm a faculty affiliate of has the Minister of Transportation as their board chair. When I first heard about this, I asked the vice president of the university, the vice president for finance and administration, why that was the case. And he told me, actually, for him at least, it's very useful because whatever the budget is that the ministry approved, the university actually only gets allocated money every month. So they have to kind of juggle who they pay and how. So he often has to go to his board chair the Ministry of Transportation. He goes to Addis and meets with him often. So then that chair can advocate to the Minister of Finance, who is his colleague from a political standpoint, to advocate for funds being released and also sort of, assist with political sort of strategy at the ministry level. So it'd be almost as though if ASU's board chair was Sean Duffy, who's the U.S. Transportation Secretary, and who I actually remember watching on The Real World on MTV when I was a kid. But anyways, so it's an interesting model because it's not as though necessarily the Minister of Transportation, right, is like an expert on Walla University or necessarily even higher education in Ethiopia. But from a political standpoint, this is a valuable position, and that's the way the model works. And similarly, in terms of the president, the Ministry of Education officially decides who the president will be. There's a process where candidates nominate themselves if a vacancy is available, officially for 5-year terms. But even just in my own personal observations, the ministry really sort of manages this process however they want. So, for example, I mentioned at the university I work with, Walla University, when I first started collaborating with them, the president was this amazing man named Mengesha Ayen, and he was the president of Wallo, and I'll talk about sort of his experiences and leadership there in a second, but he was the president, he was midway through his term, and I think in the summer of 2024, the ministry notified him that literally the next week he was going to be assigned to be the president of Bahir Dar University, which is a more prestigious university in the Amhara region, and he had been, actually was his alma mater, but he was not interested in that position. However, the ministry told him, no, you actually need to take that job. So he took the job, and he's extremely successful in that position. But even though sort of officially it was a promotion, and that was his alma mater, it's an example of how the Ministry of Education has considerable decision-making authority over the leadership of its state universities. Another example of how the ministry steers higher education is that it oversees quality issues, including the accreditation of both public and private universities. Certainly the state administration, the regional administrations have some role in that, but ultimately the process is steered by the Ministry of Education. Similarly, the ministry regulates the curriculum of both public and private universities in the country. And what I mean by that is, in contrast to the U.S., we might say, oh, okay, well, accrediting agencies indirectly, report to the federal government, and, they review every, several years, programs of study, etc. No. So in Ethiopia, this idea of steering again, it's very top down. The ministry actually develops program descriptions, as well as required courses, as well as even syllabi for courses to be taught and programs of study. So it's very detailed compared to more laissez-faire systems or, state market control type models in other contexts. And then also another interesting difference between other models of governance and a steering type model as we see in Ethiopia is that the ministry plays a very, very direct role in terms of both student admissions and faculty hires. Historically, they're maybe moving a little bit away from this, but when I started working in Ethiopia about in 2021, at the time, and still this is the case, so the way student admissions works to the undergraduate programs at all public universities is that every high school student in Ethiopia between their junior and senior year goes to an assigned university campus and is there for a week to take these honestly very high stakes admissions tests in different subject matters. It's both their graduating exit exam for high school, as well as it determines whether or not they'll be admitted to college. And then also the ministry decides who gets in, and then also where they will attend historically, as well as even which majors that they will be assigned to. So students historically have not had much agency at all around that. It has been the Ministry of Education's responsibility slash power to decide which students are admitted and what they major in, as well as to which people get hired to be faculty members or academic staff at the various universities, and where exactly they will be assigned to teach which university. So that's all within the ministry's purview. And then certainly as well, a very important thing that I alluded to before when I was talking about WALA's board is that the ministry decides the public universities' annual budgets. And certainly that's a very important thing because historically, and I'll mention this in a second, although Ethiopia is trying to move towards a more market-based model, historically they haven't their institutions have primarily relied on the central government to fund them, and historically students haven't paid much in tuition and fees directly to their universities, nor have they had large-scale externally funded projects to individual universities. So oftentimes when there are big NGOs coming in, such as, like I mentioned, MasterCard or the World Bank, if they want to invest in Ethiopia's higher education system, they don't go to individual universities. It's all through the Ministry of Education. And the Ministry of Education decides which institutions will receive funds from these multilateral organizations, how much, and sort of what that looks like. So the ministry, even in contrast to, different market models or other types of laissez-faire governance approaches, this is a pretty nice example of how a system is steered by the central government. I also want to use Ethiopia as an example for how policymaking can occur in a comparative context. So Yokoyama and Meek discussed how policy instruments can be enabling, use positive incentives, be symbolic, etc. In Ethiopia, primarily, the Ministry of Education uses a mandate-based approach. So I'm going to use an example of several policies that I've been part of, or policy implementations that I've been part of personally. So first of all, I already alluded to this previously in terms of how the government or the Ministry of Education is moving to stratify or classify its public universities. So a couple of years ago, they issued a policy directive that's called the differentiation strategy, and I've uploaded it actually to the supplemental materials on Canvas. Essentially, they're creating 3 categories of universities similar to our US-based Carnegie classification, where there's one category that's the research universities. There's one category that's universities of applied sciences, using a model, adopting a model that's common in Europe. In Germany, I think that they were really kind of motivated and informed by the University of Applied Science model in Germany and Austria. And then finally, comprehensive universities. So the government has assigned each of its universities to those 3 classes, and now it's given them very specific directives as to how the faculty, academic staff, and other administrators need to go about implementing it. So it was very top-down, and there wasn't a lot of faculty or even presidential involvement in discussion of this strategy, which has, the potential to really transform Ethiopia's higher education system. And it's something that I'm working on right now with WALA University to help define and implement what an excellent University of Applied Science looks like within the government's very, very precise implementation strategy. And then separately, too, the Ministry of Education has recently mandated this idea of autonomy, university autonomy. And this is where, interestingly, we'll see what happens in Ethiopia, but essentially introducing more market-like reforms in terms of saying, okay, rather than tuition and fees being almost free at public universities and the government pretty much giving the budgets to each university, that the government's going to allow universities to be more entrepreneurial at an individual level. And so they're testing this out. First of all, they've implemented it at Addis Ababa University, encouraging faculty to be more entrepreneurial in terms of seeking out external funding, and then also in terms of admissions, enrollments, etc. So one of the challenges and interesting complexities there especially is, as I've already mentioned, the influence of multilateral entities and development agencies at the system level, and how that's going to play out at the individual institution level, as well as, at least preliminarily, it seems like the idea of autonomy is really just mostly restricted to budget and finance, in terms of the government wants institutions to be raising more money on their own, as opposed to being related to any other type of decision, such as who the presidents will be, where the faculty will be assigned to teach, etc. So it will be interesting to see how these two strategies play out. It's also really interesting because through mandates, the government is telling institutions they need to be more autonomous. So there's a little bit of an epistemological, kind of tension there. But this is certainly, as your readings discussed this module, there's been movement globally, and many examples have been given in terms of the global north, around North America as well as Europe and Australia, etc., in terms of how higher education has become more market-like, more neoliberal, and this is certainly also seen in Ethiopia and other African and other global South countries. So most of the readings in this module are about systems and national level models of governance, but I also want to address, at least give you an introduction to institution level governance at colleges and universities across the world. So Martin Troe describes sort of the leader at the campus level, the chief campus officer. In different contexts, in the U.S., of course, we call these university presidents, sometimes vice chancellors, like in the UC system. In many European countries especially, the president role or the chief campus officer role is called the rector, so you might encounter that. But essentially, research shows today that these roles have pretty similar responsibilities across contexts, like overseeing, the high-level implementation of the institution's mission, strategic planning, the buck stops here, making difficult decisions in consultation with the board, of course, and maybe the ministry in different countries, as well as financial planning and management. But a very important caveat is, of course, the environment and sort of the context really affects how and what the president's role looks like. And I'm going to give, of course, because this is what I know best, but a really good example from Ethiopia, from Wall University. So, as I think I mentioned, Wall University was, their campus was the scene of a battle in the Civil War that occurred in their country in 2022. And so this is their campus. This is President Mengesha actually in his office. This is his office building. There were drones, there were tanks that were fighting on the campus, and it damaged the buildings and the infrastructure, and sort of there was a lot of loss of life there. So this is his office. This is the university administration building. This is some of the damage, extensive damage, just an example of the extensive damage that occurred on the campus in 2022. And so he was the president, and so he had to manage through that crisis. And so he oversaw, and this is actually me visiting in 2025, only 3 years later, He was able to tap into diaspora donors and different NGOs, different countries to donate money with the approval, of course, of the Ministry of Education to rebuild. This is now their campus community center. In addition to all of the physical damage, there was a ton of looting, very awful destruction that happened. And there's still some evidence of that. Here is a picture I took when I was visiting the campus of some rebuilding that was going on. This is like scaffolding on some of the buildings that were disrepaired destructed. And then here, though, is the president's office that I showed here before with all of the windows blown out and everything like that. The central administration building has been repaired and rebuilt. And here is the campus senior management team. So as I mentioned, Mengesha, he helped rebuild the university. He led it forward. And then the Ministry of Education, I think partially because of his success there and his excellent political skills and interpersonal skills, they appointed him to be at Bahir Dar University, and his provost, his academic vice president here in the middle, President Awal, was appointed to be the president after a lot of political maneuverings behind the scenes, I'll just say. But there's Awal, and there's his vice president, his academic vice president, his provost, Burhanu, and there's Dr. Tergin. He's the VP of administration, and other members of their administration team, and that's me right there in front of this beautifully rehabilitated building. But again, so this goes to the chief campus officer at a university, of course, has a lot of, right now in kind of contemporary higher education, very similar high-level responsibilities. But when it comes down to the details of an individual institution situation, those responsibilities, certainly vary in terms of context. So I mentioned senior management team in the context of Wallow, but that term is used globally to refer to the top level administrators at universities. So there's not actually a lot of research about what specifically senior management teams look like in comparative perspective. In terms of my own personal observations, it's almost always includes the university's chief academic officer or the provost, as well as the top person on the business and finance side of things, maybe development, et cetera. But it depends on the context and depends on the university type and the scope of the institution's, services and activities. But this is an area where there's certainly a lot more research that's necessary in terms of what exactly the senior management team at different universities do from a comparative standpoint, what their roles are, and what sort of leads to effectiveness. I can tell you, at least in the case of Ethiopia, so while the Ministry of Education appoints the president as well as the board, the president gets to choose his or her senior management team. The ministry approves it, but it's kind of pro forma. So, for example, as I mentioned, President Awal, here he is with his senior management team. I asked a number of candid questions. I've asked them, and they're very honest with me about kind of how this process works. And Awal and his senior management team, Burhanu and Terkin, told me both that, they're good friends. And I saw this in person. We would go to dinner. They're great friends. They have a lot, kind of a very good rapport with one another. And so at least in Ethiopia, for the president, they get to appoint their own senior management team. I'm not familiar with a lot of good research in terms of, from a global perspective, what the senior management team sort of process looks like in terms of appointment and responsibilities and who structurally is part of that. But at least from the Ethiopian perspective, that's what they consist of. So while there isn't a lot of research about senior management teams from a comparative perspective yet, I have a feeling we will see that coming in the future because there is some scholarship around trends in institution level governance. And as you might recall, historically, some systems have been more decentralized while others historically more centralized in terms of, again, this is at the institution level. So a decentralized institutional governance looks more like, a lot more faculty involvement at the, guild and or sort of local level of academic units. And that's how the French university model was typically how decisions were made in terms of admissions, budgeting, sort of scholarship, etc., very decentralized. While the U.S. university model, in contrast, has been much more centralized over time in terms of leading the way of having professionalized administration, including those trained in higher education administration graduate programs, for example, as well as, sort of more professionalized senior management, presidents, vice presidents, sort of business officers, etc. And there's a global trend, even in France, as I've already talked about, towards more centralized professional models where faculty-led models have lost favor. Mostly, it's this idea of neoliberalism, corporatization, more efficient, more accountability if we have sort of professional administration. So definitely a trend globally away from shared decision-making with faculty. Again, the idea is it's inefficient, towards more hierarchical decision-making, putting sort of that power in the hands of administrators. And then a tendency towards diminished power of faculty senates. We certainly see this at Arizona State. And then towards more power on the side of governing boards and especially, too, I want to mention also a tendency towards governing boards being appointed with primarily external stakeholders. So this has been seen, there's been research in Belgium, in Spain, Italy, France, the Netherlands, where local authorities and like politicians and industry stakeholders, etc., have been appointed more and more towards governing boards and given sort of that kind of authority. So less internal sort of stakeholder involvement in governing boards and more of sort of a tendency globally, again, this is internationally, towards more external decision makers involved in governing boards. And then, too, here's another trend that we could use as an example of kind of this movement towards more centralized decision making. In the past, many mid-level, quote-unquote, academic managers, I'm sure my dean would hate me if she heard me use that term, but it's a term used in scholarship. Mid-level managers or mid-level administrators, especially on the academic side, historically in many universities, especially the European context, were elected by faculty. They would choose their leader, basically, their department chairs, their deans, etc. More and more deans are appointed by management, so by the president or the provost, and ASU is a great example of that. And that's more and more the case, though, from a global standpoint. So movement towards centralized decision making. So wrapping up here, this has just been some supplemental ideas around both system level governance from a comparative and international standpoint, as well as some ideas about how institution level decision making is looking from a comparative perspective.